Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our latest webinar series with QLI. My name is Steve Kershke. I have Brad Dexter and a new guest in the studio, Mr. Don Terry.
Good morning.
He always says he's only a face for radio. We'll see if he has a radio voice.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody.
Just a quick introduction of QLI. For those of you who are familiar with QLI and have joined our webinars in the past, welcome back. For those of you who are maybe a bit unfamiliar with QLI, we are a post-acute rehab provider based in Omaha, Nebraska. We specialize in treating individuals who've suffered spinal cord injuries, brain injuries, and other catastrophic injuries throughout the country, actually. So we have individuals coming from all over the United States to Omaha, and we have the opportunity to transition them back into the real world. So it's a really great opportunity for us, and we're really thankful for the partners who are here listening today. And actually, this topic is really timely around the continuum. We happen to sit at the post-acute level of the continuum, and thankfully, we have partners who come before us, from the time someone gets injured and really sets the table for us. Brad, you and I had an opportunity to meet with Tim Feeney, and he called us table setters.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure if that was a compliment or if it was just a description. It was maybe a little bit of both.
Yeah, maybe a little bit of both, but I like to think, we're pretty darn good table setters. So,
so we'll see. I think at the end of the day, we're all table setters because we're trying to get people back to life. So before we jump into today's webinar, just some housekeeping. Reminder that there's going to be a poll question at the end of this presentation. You need to fill that out in order to get your CEUs. We'll give you another reminder towards the end. Don't get this confused with a few other poll questions that we have. We're trying to get some audience participation today. So we'll try to be as clear on that as we can. Don and Brad, make sure we don't screw that up.
yeah.
But without any further delay, let's jump into the topic today. We're going to be talking about the continuum. We're going to be talking about it mainly from the post-acute and community-based part of the continuum, but we're going to look at it from a big picture perspective. And so here we go. A few things that we're going to touch on. So we're going to touch quickly on learning topics or learning concepts. And these are some things that we talk about here at QLI. It's an approach that we use to educate all of our team members, all of our families and injured workers coming through. And so we think it ties quite a bit to not only the rehab setting, but the real world. And I use it with my kids and my wife sometimes, things like that. We're going to talk about the continuum of care at a high level. We'll talk about transitions, and then we're hoping to give a little bit of a framework around how to make decisions. And this will be the most murky part of this presentation, because as we dug into it, it gets pretty complex once you kind of peel back the layers. So
yeah, there's not an exact like what to do. It's more like how to think about some of this,
absolutely,
right?
Which I think ultimately that's the idea today is how do we share how to think, and there's going to be probably some discrepancies on how to go about doing that in a way that's a good thing. Here's a quick high-level overview of our learning mantras. We call them the components of learning. You might hear us call them learning mantras, components of recovery. Those are all interchangeable terms. At a quick high level, there are 6 of them. We used the imagery of a cube. If you think of a cube, there's 6 sides to a cube. So when you leave today and someone asks you, hey, what'd you learn? Hopefully you learned about a cube and you realize that there are 6 learning components that could be really helpful throughout your world. If you look at that little red pawn, almost a game piece, the intent of that is to show that these learning mantras are not linear in nature. They should be leveraged at various times throughout the process. Although we might talk about them in a linear fashion, just know that you can leverage them and implement them at various points in time and to various degrees. So very quickly, motivate with meaning. This is the idea that we all have some sort of identity. And when that identity is not clear or completely stripped away, that can be problematic. So we have to make sure that that's in place. Identify the interferences down there on the bottom left. These are the things that get in the way of skill development and learning and growth. And there's a variety of things that this could refer to, but it could be some skills and competency, right? So this is the idea that people go to rehab to gain skills, right? And you have a teacher that does that. But there could be some internal interferences too, such as a brain injury, some stress and other factors within our life that interfere with us being able to really take on a big challenge. And then a couple that go hand in hand is tie it to the task and step outside the comfort zone. Tie it to the task is this idea that we have to know where we're going. That's that flag at the very top. And there's several steps to get there. And each step is really critical and really important. But whether you're looking at the most basic step or the step that's really close to that flag, it should look like that flag in some way, right? And so for us, it could be someone's going home or going back to work. And there's a lot of factors that we have to look at in order to get someone there. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then, like I said, the comfort zone idea is that at each point, we want to push someone just outside their comfort zone. We don't want to push them too far. That can be frustrating and demoralizing. But if we just keep them in their comfort zone, there's no learning and there's no growth. And so there's a fine line with that. Support for success. This is the idea that everyone likely has a coach or a mentor at some point in your life. And so that can come from external factors or internal factors. We all have the ability to take a step back and reflect on what our performance was. So even after this presentation today, Brad, Don, and I are probably going to step back and say, hey, what went well, what didn't go well? When there's an injury of some sort, that can be impacted and we have to make some adjustments there. So just know that there's a couple ways to do that. And then lastly, repeat, repeat, repeat. The idea that repetition is important. It should be embedded within all of these different concepts. And we have to make sure that we find ways to help individuals repeat whatever it is they're trying to learn. So that is like the 10-second overview of the 6 components of learning. And we'll refer to these throughout the process. And just another plug, we have a full presentation on these, so we could spend an entire hour and a half, and don't get Brad and I talking about this one. Okay, quick high level, and then Brad, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah.
We're going to assume that most of our listeners are pretty familiar with what the continuum is after a catastrophic injury. So talking about a brain injury or a spinal cord injury, typically one that's more severe in nature. So at the time of injury, someone is likely going to go to ICU for a pretty short stay. Usually it's around 7 days or so. And at this point, really the intent is to keep this person alive, get them stable again, and get them ready for the next step, which is typically acute care. When we think of acute care, I think especially in the workers' comp world, there's a variety of centers of excellence around the country. And really, these are specialized hospitals that primarily deal with injuries like we're talking about. And for the sake of today, we're going to assume that most of these injured workers are going to get to that point. If you're listening and you don't use a center of excellence at the acute care model, at the acute care level, that would be something that we would strongly encourage you to consider. It's kind of like going to get your shoulder reconstruction done by a knee guy, right? And so that doesn't always make sense. And so it's maybe not that drastic, but we want to make sure that people are getting to the right spot, because it actually, in terms of table setting, it sets the table for the rest of the continuum. And at the post-acute level, right, this is where QLI sits. We happen to still be an inpatient facility, and most post-acute facilities are. At this level, there starts to be a shift, but there's still a pretty intense approach here, and it's this balance of medical aspects, but you're starting to pull in other more complex aspects of someone's life because they're ready for it and they need it, and we need to set them up for getting to the community-based level. So typically this person's going home. They might go to an assisted living or something similar. For example, at QLI, about 85% of the people that we see go home, and that's a really great thing, right? So we want to make sure that we're setting them up for success. Just a point to mention here, at the community-based level, we're talking about outpatient therapy, traditional outpatient therapy, but there's also this health and wellness component that we talk a lot about, and that starts to come in as someone gets further and further away from their injury. So there's the continuum. We will continue to touch on that as well, but we want to make sure everyone's starting from the same spot. So with that, this is what the full continuum looks like. As I mentioned, ICU is relatively short. Acute care is going to be roughly 30 days. post-acute care, average length of stay at QLI is around 90 days, and community-based care is typically the longest because hopefully that's where people are getting to. So this is the continuum. With that, Brad, I think you got a story for us.
Yeah, I think, we really wanted to kind of not just talk about this in theory, but put a face to some of it, right? Put a life to some of it too. So I'd encourage you guys, as you're listening, if you resonate with what we're talking about, think about someone that you're working with, a case that you're managing, a family that you're working with, and try to put them into these scenarios too. But this is Abe. I met Abe in 2018. He had a C6 level spinal cord injury, and he had been through, just thinking about the continuum of care, he had been through the ICU and the acute rehab phase, and he came to QLI for that post-acute rehab. And he spent, I think he spent 6 or 7 months at QLI in total. And I think about him in terms of, the learning concepts, learning mantras that we talked about earlier. And, he was a joy to be around. He developed good relationships with people. He had, he was pretty young at the time, 19, 20 years old. But he had a fiance. He had parents, brother, sister that were really involved in his life. Good group of friends, and he had a lot to look forward to. He hit his rehab really hard. It was not hard to find what motivated him. He was very, very driven when he was here, made a ton of progress. Got, if we're thinking about it from like a functional standpoint, he made loads of recovery and was managing a lot of his lifestyle transfers, ADL needs, care needs pretty independently for his level of injury. He had support from his payer source as well. They were working on building him a home. This truck that you see is his vehicle. And this picture, I love how it shows freedom in a lot of ways. It's access into the world and not being cooped up necessarily. And so he had a lot of the pieces of the puzzle in place. And he transitioned home after his time in post-acute rehab and was doing community-based services. But little by little, some of the pieces of the puzzle started falling away. He had his relationship start to crumble, and that impacted his mood. It impacted his lifestyle. It impacted wanting to get out of bed at times. His support systems changed. His home wasn't done when he went home, and so he was staying with family for a time before he was able to get into an accessible place that he was living in and managing on a full-time basis. He started having some interferences in his life, right? The ones that I just listed, but also medical interferences, recurrent UTIs that were causing issues, a lot of spasms. He developed HO in one of his hips, which started impacting his ability to transfer, and his seating and positioning in his wheelchair, his truck batteries. Something's going on with the wiring in the truck, and so it's draining these batteries over and over, and it makes it difficult for him to get out, right? So I could go on with some of those things, but what I want to point out is, we had helped him kind of put a lot of these pieces of life back together, got back into the community, was doing well for a time, and then things just kind of started, coming apart a little bit.
Just
right?
like life for us, right?
Like life for us.
life
It's
is
not
not
static. Wow, jinx. It's not static. And so there were a lot of changes. And he, also as a young guy, he's learning to be resilient. He's learning to kind of rise to some of these challenges that I think any of us, even young in life, it's hard to see that when you're in it and know how you're going to respond to it too. So he's doing it with a spinal cord injury. And so we're just going to use some of his stories as we go through and try to put a face to some of this.
Thanks. All right. So at this point, Brad and I, Don, hop in here as you see fit. We're going to talk a little bit more about what happens throughout the continuum at this point. And especially with brain injury, I think with spinal cord injury, this slide is a bit easier, right? Depending on the level of injury and the severity of the injury, you can somewhat predict how someone is going to, how someone with a spinal cord injury's life is going to play out in terms of level of support. There's a lot of factors that we can't predict, of course. But at the end of the day, a general broad brush concept is that earlier on in the injury, outcome predictability is lower. But as someone moves further and further away, we can start to predict, assuming everything goes well, where they might land, and also what some of the risk factors are. And so that's, for us, we're at the luxury at the post-acute community-based level to say, okay, we've seen how this has played out. We can see what the risk factors are, and we can see what the strengths are, and we can, with pretty good surety, start to predict a few things, but a concept nonetheless to keep in mind. The other thing to remember is that the support is extremely high early on, and as we move throughout the continuum, support starts to fade, especially at the community-based level. Now, it depends on, support system and the type of facility that you might be in, and the city that you live in, and some of the resources that you have. But at the end of the day, we have to prepare these individuals to live with a low level of support as independently as possible, which means we have to equip them with a lot of skills and the ability to make decisions, and help them develop this level of resiliency and perseverance that can be really challenging, especially when you layer on some of these factors that we've been talking about. So, Brad, I'll let you talk a little bit about the team. So we're going to talk about the team from a traditional perspective, and then, moving on down, maybe some considerations.
Yeah. Keep in mind any of those slides where we've kind of shown that continuum, and from ICU into post-acute care. Look at this long list of team members, people that are involved in the care of the individual, right? The person themselves, their family and support system, all the way down to, at QLI, we call it life path services, vocational services, and nutrition. So there's a lot of people involved, a lot of people thinking from many, many different angles. Yep. Right. But as you transition through that care and you make that transition into more community-based services, that support system kind of decreases, mm-hmm. right? So you have the individual and their support system, and then you have, maybe some smattering of these other services. You're going to see a physician, irregularly throughout the year. As an example, Abe had a lot of things going on from a bladder standpoint, and working with a urologist, I think in the last couple of years, he's probably spent a total of 30 minutes with that individual. And so it's hard to get a full picture of what that looks like in just those little touch points, right? And then you have, PT, OT, speech, and that might be episodic care that happens. So people are kind of in and out of your life, and you've got to figure out how to take that. So support is going to change.
Yeah. And I think what we're showing here is, and this is probably the least accessible aspect of the community-based level, is being able to find and interact with a multidisciplinary therapy team. Oftentimes we see that it looks a little bit more siloed like this one. And while, it can be done, finding a clinic or finding a group of people that work really closely together is really, it's one of the best ways to make sure someone stays on track, and that we start to leverage some of the expertise that happens. The other thing we want to start to show you is what hopefully functional recovery looks over time. This is the ideal scenario, right? So someone gradually makes progress starting in ICU and up through community-based care. Hopefully they ride off into the sunset and they're back to 100%, which can happen, but we know that is maybe not the most frequent type of situation. So, but there's a few concepts here that we want to talk about. And I think if you look at the very top part of this, we're talking about this in terms of ICU through the post-acute level. And I mentioned earlier, medical intensity is extremely high, especially in ICU and especially in acute rehab. And as someone moves through the continuum, they become more stable, which is a good thing. And as a result, we can challenge them more intensely, mm-hmm. right? And we can start to layer on more aspects of their life. And so just understanding that as medical intensity declines, therapeutic intensity should go up. What that looks like, though, at the community-based level, I think it starts to shift. And this is something, Brad, you and I have talked a lot about, right? Is how do you make sure that once someone gets to the community-based level and medical stability has pretty much stayed in place. Now, Abe's situation is a little bit different, but there's going to be things that pop up, but for the most part, they're medically stable. But at the end of the day, it looks a little bit like a roller coaster, just like life does. And how we attack that should, be similar to how it looks in terms of how someone works through their life. And so we've started to talk about this idea that therapeutic intensity should be inversely correlated to someone's life trajectory, right? So in this next slide, right? So if you look at the bottom part, therapeutic intensity, you can see what that looks like compared to someone's life trajectory in the blue, right? So as someone's life trajectory starts to decline, we need to bump up our support in terms of therapeutic intensity. So in the course of Abe, why don't you talk a little bit about that, how that looks in practice?
Yeah. So, I mean, just following maybe life trajectory for him, if you think about from, the ICU to acute to post acute, it was going up. And even as he kind of shifted into community-based rehab, you maybe think about that trend line continuing to move up, but then we start having these dips, interferences that are kind of coming in. And, there's a couple options. You step in at the right time, right, with the right amount of support, and maybe you can reverse that dip a little bit, right? I think in his case, a few times that support wasn't necessarily there in all of the areas that he needed it, right? And so you can continue to kind of see that life trajectory going down a little bit more until you get the right support stepping in place to help go the other direction, right? So the intensity or the help that he needed as trajectory went down was higher, right? And as his trajectory started coming back up again, that intensity can wane.
Yep. Well, and I think what we want to make sure we're starting to think about is not looking at once someone gets to a community-based level and they get through, traditional outpatient therapy, just kind of setting it and forgetting it, right? And I don't know that that's like a common thing necessarily, but we see it a lot where there's this mindset around we get them to a certain spot and we assume that they can take it and run. Abe's a perfect example of someone who is a smart guy, right? A pretty educated guy, had some resources that he could leverage. And thankfully, he had a work comp payer who understood this concept and said, hey, how do we continue to help this guy long term? And that's the ideal situation because we just know things are going to happen that are some things we can control and some things we can't. And we have to be prepared for both. Okay, we're going to talk about something that we call cross bridges, and there's a couple ways to look at this. There's bridges between the levels of care, which you can see we've highlighted there. There's also bridges within levels of care, right? And so at the acute level, post-acute level, these are simple things like at the acute rehab hospital, shift change, right? So, someone, you have a nursing staff that's on during the day, a new nursing staff that's on overnight, and then a new nursing staff that switches again. And so that little bit of a change can create some disruption or some chaos. And that's a really small example. But we know that when things change or when things are maybe less predictable, it should at least be a red flag. And we talk about it in terms of good things that happen and maybe some things that maybe are not so good. So in this scenario, right, when someone makes some improvement, we should capitalize on that. And it should be a red flag that maybe we, tweak something to keep them moving in the upward direction. Or when something dips, like Brad mentioned with Abe, what do we need to do to make sure that that dip doesn't happen for a long time or very drastically? Okay, so it's a concept that we start to think about. We educate people on because when we foreshadow that things are going to ebb and flow, right, we can start to prepare for them. We can recognize them early and make sure that we have some support in place and a plan for that when it happens rather than being reactive in nature. So Brad, let's talk about the change curve. I'll let you take this one.
Yeah. So, you look at this graph and just to kind of like orient you guys, the y-axis is kind of illustrating impact in someone's life, right? So higher up it is, it's positive impact. The lower it is, it's negative impact. And this is not a concept that's just related to healthcare. I mean, this is something that's been around for 40, 50 years now, right? In literature and books, and it's used kind of across the spectrums that you might think about. But it's just recognizing that, hey, we all go through changes in our life, and how do you kind of navigate through some of those changes, right? So that dot right there might even illustrate a bridge of some kind, a point that we have to think about how we're going to navigate that process. But you can see, over the little squiggly line is just going to illustrate, there may be some kind of like positive change that's happening in our life, but then there's some kind of a bridge, some kind of an interference that happens that might turn us the other direction. What are the emotions and the thoughts that we're going to go through, and how are you going to help someone navigate to a point of maybe accepting that change and moving forward through it?
Absolutely. And we've talked about this too, is this idea that once that change happens, there can be an immediate recognition or a delay, right? That's this like second dotted line to the right-hand side there. But at the end of the day, we want to make sure that that dip, which we know is going to happen, happens pretty quickly. And we have to fill that gap somehow so it doesn't start to look like this. And, you know, Abe, again, another example is that he's gone through lots of these, right? A really easy example in terms of the continuum is leaving QLI and going home.
Yep.
Leaving QLI is the yellow dot. The delay of how that looks, right? It looks different for everyone, right? And we hope we prepared him for that.
Exactly. And what do you do in our setting to try to, you know, make that little dip as shallow as possible? You try to educate support system as well as you possibly can. You educate Abe as well as you possibly can in everything that he needs to do. You help them understand what potential novel situations they might experience and how can they start to think about navigating those. You know, what might arise from an interference standpoint. You certainly can't think about everything, but what supports do we put in place? Do we have accessible vehicles? Do we have accessible homes? You know, what are we thinking about for purpose of day, job, community? Like all of those things are things that we need to address to try to help decrease that. Again, we can't control everything, but
yeah, and I think we're talking about really simple concepts that are not necessarily easy to implement, right?
Right.
This idea of fading support is nothing new and groundbreaking, but how you execute that and what you do to stay on board and do it in an effective way, I think is really this art behind, you know, delivering care and making sure someone's successful, not just while they're in our facility, but long-term over the course of their entire life, and not just a snippet of their life. And I think when we talk about, you know, new clinicians coming into QLI and all of our team members, we're starting to say like, look, we're table setters, right? To use Dr. Feeney's term. But at the end of the day, if we all look at ourselves like table setters, then we start to have this big picture vision for after they leave QLI, there's a lot of things that are going to come up, some really great opportunities, but some challenges. And how do we make sure that we account for both of those?
Yep.
So it's a mindset piece. Okay. So we're going to get into a little bit of a game which we have named which level of care, right? So it's probably not the most exciting game show, but it's a little bit of a game show.
Don, I think you had a theme song that you were going to sing for this.
I know, but it's very creative title.
Don, you've been so quiet today. I know you have something to say. Maybe you can participate in this part. Okay, so for the sake of this game, we're going to assume that everyone is coming from an acute rehab setting, because what we end up finding is this is the point in time that there's some complexity and some decisions that need to be made that vary depending on lots of variables. So we know that likely after ICU, someone's going to go to an acute rehab setting. We're just going to assume that that happened. We know that that's not always the case. But for the sake of today, the three options are skilled nursing facility, post-acute rehab, and community-based services. This is where Brad and I spent a ton of time and tried to say, like, how do we simplify this decision? And the more that we peeled back the layers, it was really hard. Brad, we've probably had 10 conversations at different times on this. We could probably have 10 more. And this is also where, as you're listening to this, you probably have opinions that differ from ours or maybe are the same as ours, and we recognize that. But for the sake of creating conversation and dialogue, we wanted to at least narrow it down to where we're at today. And I think where we started with is, you know, two really simple ways to make an initial decision after acute rehab is, what's the therapeutic intensity that someone needs, and what level of structure and support do they need, right? And we understand that therapeutic intensity, like how we define that, could look very, very different. And how you look at structure and support can look very, very different. And for some of the scenarios that we're going to show, we think that the answer is pretty straightforward, but there's definitely some that are not. And so you see on the outside of that center box, there's a few other factors that we consider. So Brad, let's kind of just run through these pretty quick and make sure that we talk about why they are meaningful.
Yeah, I mean, so thinking back time since injury, right? There's a higher level of support needed right after maybe a catastrophic injury of some kind. And so obviously that would not be an appropriate time for someone to go home or perhaps get community-based services, things that we need to think about. Rehab potential. I mean, for a lot of you that are maybe working with catastrophic injury or have done that for for a long time, you're looking at someone initially after an injury, and you start to understand maybe a level of spinal cord injury or severity of a brain injury. And you've been around it long enough, you've read the research, you kind of know where they might end up in the long term. So you make some of those educated guesses without exactly knowing what that's going to look like. And then maybe you start to determine how you help them navigate the continuum of care based off of that.
Well, and it's tied to time of injury too, right?
Yep.
I mean, I think that's where these start to bleed into each other is, the closer someone is to injury, we start to make some assumptions that there's a lot of progress still to be made. And the further on, not that there's not progress to be made, we believe that 100%, really, no matter what. It's just like the degree of that and the level of impact that might have starts to go down the further out you go, right?
Absolutely. Social and emotional factors, maybe even tying to this is maybe the individual's ability to learn quickly, and we know that grief and those changes, not just for an individual, but for their family as well, are going to impact their ability to maybe care for themselves or care for their loved one over a longer period of time, right?
Yep. And some of these are factors that have been in place even before an injury, and looking at factors not only from the injured person, but their support system and like, for a spouse, how emotionally equipped is the spouse, and what's the social network look like around that family?
Yep.
Certainly, there's still going to be struggles, but the stronger that support system is and the stronger the foundation, you can start to make some assumptions.
And we always talk about resiliency as a skill, right? It's something that all of us over the course of our lives, people that we encounter have different levels of resiliency based off of what they've encountered in life, right? And
Yep.
so we also think, though, that that's something that you can build. It's a skill that you can build into people, and that's something that we try to take into account with the rehab that we're delivering.
Yep. So if you start to go down those other two on the right-hand side, home and community access, local services. So home and community access is really like, what is the resources around wherever they're going? Can they even get into the home? You talked about Abe, right? He had some adaptations to his home that weren't totally finished. What's the timing of that? Ideally, he goes home when they're all finished, because we know that that's a disruption and a potential interference.
Yeah.
So just looking at where we're at with that. Local services, this could simply be, is there a job there or a volunteer opportunity there? Is there social and community opportunities to just integrate back into that community? But then this is also providers, right? Is there a provider with a level of expertise needed to step in or continue care beyond a certain level of care within the continuum? And we've talked a little bit about the support system, right? And that kind of goes into the social emotional factors. I think the complexity of injury and outcome goals are really interesting. When I think of outcome goals, to get someone back to work and being a dad and, doing what I would consider really high level skills, that can take a long time, and putting all of those pieces back together is no easy task. And I think sometimes we overestimate how easy that can be.
Yeah.
And we overestimate how much can be done, say at the community-based level, right? Where we're going to talk a little bit about some of the pros and cons of that.
Table setters.
Yep. And then the complexity of injury, right? So how serious is the brain injury, and what are the abilities in terms of problem solving and reasoning and safety and things like that. So these are all factors that need to be considered. So hopefully we've kind of given you a perspective and a glimpse under the hood as to where we're coming at this, but we're also trying to, give a framework for some decision making. So at this point, we're going to launch a few polls here. These are not the questions necessarily for CEUs. These are meant to create some dialogue, and we're going to have some commentary with this. So hopefully we set this up in a way that it works. So first question, which level of care? So if the therapeutic intensity needs are high, the structure and support needs are high, let's talk about which level of care do we want. So I'll go ahead and launch, and hopefully those of you who are with us can give us some feedback. A lot of crowd participation today. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Man, we need the Jeopardy theme song.
I know. Don, where are you at?
Yeah.
All right. So just we'll go ahead and end the poll here. But for those of you who are listening, about 59% of you, we'll go ahead and share that. Here's what we got. So 59% of the group felt that post-acute rehab was appropriate, 31 skilled nursing, and 10% community-based. So, Brad, what do you think?
Gosh, so high level of intensity, high structure and support. I think about traditional skilled nursing facility. Maybe you're not going to get as high of the intensity there, right? I might put that a little more like moderate to low intensity, but high structure and support. So I was thinking a little more along the post-acute rehab lines.
Yeah, I mean, I think we think of, if someone's going to leave acute rehab and go to a skilled facility, I really do think like this is someone who maybe the rehab potential for whatever reason at that point in time seems a little low. We want to give them a little bit more time to even have some spontaneous recovery so that they can maximize what happens at the post-acute level, right? Because we know at the post-acute level, therapeutic intensity is going to be really high. And if someone can't participate in that, it may not be the best use or the right time for them to get there. So it doesn't mean they can't get there. It just means they might not be the right time to do that. And to that point, understanding that skilled nursing level is really moderate to low intensity of therapy. Typically, they're not super specialized in nature, and their resources around therapy just look different than more of a post-acute provider. All right. Here we go again. Which level of care? So here's what the survey said. So about 67% said community-based, 10% post-acute, 23% skilled.
I think I'm with the community-based services on that one. Again, I think just being out in the community, you're going to have, little less structure, only what you impose on yourself, obviously, and your support system is going to be lower. Thinking back to those slides that we had earlier, siloed versus more collaborative care in the community-based setting versus what you see ICU through post-acute, where you're going to have a lot of clinicians and healthcare workers that are working alongside the support system and the family, higher level of structure and support there. So yeah, community-based services.
Yeah, I think for me, I saw a couple of the skilled nursing votes. Appreciate that the intensity at the skilled nursing level is probably a bit lower, but I would say structure and support is typically higher at that point in time. So the needs of someone at that level probably wouldn't land me in the skilled nursing facility. Although I think there's one thing we should mention is like this isn't like a fixed level here, and there's certainly some other variables that we're talking about too. But I agree. All right, this is where I think it's going to start getting interesting. So here we go. I lied. It's going to get interesting after this one. All right. So 65% skilled, a little bit split between post-acute and community-based. So Brad, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, this is back to the first question. This is kind of what I was thinking of for a skilled nursing facility, higher structure and support, but maybe a little less intensity. Ooh, and you have community-based services on there too, right? Yeah, so I guess I can see that. Like maybe there's going to be a little lower intensity, but like we were talking about Abe, maybe there's a way that you provide the right structure and support in one of those dips.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing that now that I'm even thinking about it, you could make an argument for the post-acute. I appreciate the folks who had post-acute on there as well, because there are situations where you have someone come to QLI who they're like intensity of therapy needs. They may not be able to tolerate that, and we might not think that they can make a ton of progress. But we have to get some things in place for the family and structure. Maybe their house needs to be put in place, and we're going to take a flyer on someone, right? We've had some people like that who come to QLI. And some of them have been exactly that. And some of them made a ton of progress.
Yep.
And they surprised us. So I probably should have put post-acute. I was thinking community-based on this one, in the sense that a lot of times we have injured workers. I can think of one right now who has a high amount of PCA time because he's pretty independent physically, and his primary challenges are cognitively based around safety and impulsivity, and putting having this person go to a skilled nursing facility, given his age and how young he is. He actually lives right next door to his family, right? So there's a high level of support for that. The intensity of therapy itself isn't necessarily high, but the amount of structure and support is relatively high, given the PCA time, given the use of technology. We're using some remote patient monitoring with this person. So I think using technology at this level makes it possible too. But, I think this is where you have to start to understand the factors, right? Age, skilled or support system, right? He happens to be young with a high level of support. And so that's probably why it got tipped over to the community-based level.
Yep.
Okay, so therapeutic intensity high, structure and support low. So we're starting to get a little bit more mixed here, right? So you got 27% saying skilled, 44% saying community-based or post-acute, and 29 community-based. So Brad, where are you at?
I think I could see when you just put my answers up on there. Yeah. I was just going to say,
let's debate it. What do you think?
well, so here's what I was thinking. At QLI specifically, I was thinking, okay, post-acute rehab, you're going to get high intensity in that setting, but there's a case for maybe a decrease in the amount of structure and support that person needs, even over the course of their time at QLI, right? That's something that we have to identify and then kind of help as people are launching out from QLI, right? But I could also see that in the community-based setting where maybe you're supplementing some outpatient therapy with personal trainer or fitness times that enable you to kind of increase the intensity of the services that you're receiving, but you're doing that with low structure, low support, pretty autonomous.
I agree. This is one where it's like, okay, you start to look at some of those other factors. I think convenience is a factor. I think structure and support. While I think most of the time, this individual actually lands at the community-based level. And although I think our poll shows post-acute, I think there's situations where, there's this idea that you can get an intense level of therapy at the community-based level. But when doing this too soon, the structure and the support actually isn't enough for this person to really thrive. Or the structure and support isn't as holistic in nature, and it's very centrally focused on maybe one or two disciplines. So here's a couple of examples. One, someone spinal cord injury, maybe incomplete spinal cord injury, and goes to a highly intense walking and mobility program, right? So getting back to walking and high level of mobility is the primary focus. But I think sometimes what gets missed is these social factors and who's going to take care of them when they're, not quite able to take care of themselves. And so there's some caregiver burden, and are they able to go back to work? And all of those factors end up, not that they're not being addressed, but they're not being addressed at the intensity that I think that they need, with the amount of support and repetition that actually makes an impact. Another situation where we just got a referral for someone who went to a really intense aphasia program. And I'm making some assumptions right now, but I'm assuming that the primary focus of that aphasia program was communication. And as a result, this person is not driving. They don't have a sense of identity or purpose. And so there's these other factors within their life that either are being missed or just maybe not effectively being addressed.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that that's a factor that, even though someone needs a high level of intensity and maybe cognitively or physically their level of support is a bit low, what could you do and how fast could you get there by maybe putting someone in a post-acute program over a community-based program. So just some food for thought.
Yeah.
We didn't really address skilled nursing. Again, I think when I think of skilled nursing, I don't think of a highly intense program. I think of it as highly supportive. So that would be maybe why I would knock that one out in this case. Okay, last one.
I think as we can tell by these poll questions, there's really no wrong answer, but a lot of factors that play into the decision-making.
Hence why we had a really hard time narrowing it down to like one or two things to like trigger the decision.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's a really good observation, Don. And exactly, like there's a lot of ways to look at this. But I think ultimately what we were hoping to do is like plant some seeds and start to get people thinking, you know, if you tend to do one thing over another.
Well, and back to the comment we made early on in the presentation, we're not going to tell you exactly what to do here, but how to think about it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, hopefully as we go through some of these poll questions, you know, you're not just like, you guys are stupid. Why are you doing that one? Right. But hopefully you're like, oh, well, yeah, I guess I could see that. That's, you know, so.
Well, and maybe getting better at looking at those ancillary things,
Sure.
right? For the last two, especially, I really think you have to start to look at what is surrounding this individual that maybe accounts for, you know, if where we send that person has a lower level of structure and support, what's going to fill the gap to like boost that up, right? Like that's how I look at it. And, you know,
yeah, there's usually a cost benefit analysis that goes into these decisions, right? What are the pros? What are the cons? You know, be realistic about it.
So I don't know that I have much to add. I mean, I was expecting this one to be pretty split. I think this is an example of there's a lot of factors that would put someone in any of these scenarios. And you know, we're getting down to a little bit of time. I want to have some time for questions. We got about 5-10 minutes left, Brad, and we have a few more slides. So we'll keep going here. And if there's any other commentary at the end, we're happy to revisit this. So we put post-acute rehab and community-based. I agree. We probably could have thrown in skilled here. And there's a good argument for that as well.
There's one comment that came in that motivation plays a super important part in making a lot of these decisions too.
Totally agree. And I think someone's ability to take accountability and responsibility and high level of motivation, I think could put them in one or the other, right? So someone who I think is highly motivated and accountable, yeah, you could make a really great argument that if they need a highly intense therapy program, but they want to do it at more of a community-based level, you can give them that opportunity. But let's make sure we don't overestimate how hard that is going to be for them. On the flip side, putting someone with a high level of motivation in a post-acute program, that might be a really short-lived post-acute program with a high amount of productivity and progress, right? So it could just be a few weeks or to a month, and then they're off even further, even faster. So just thinking about what's the ROI on that, because when you put someone who's highly motivated in our program, man, they thrive, right? And there's just this level of intensity that I think is of benefit. So those are the things I process, but I 100% agree that motivation is a big factor. Okay, so here's some risk and considerations when we poorly manage the continuum, right? So I think the first one, when someone gets moved through the continuum too quickly or doesn't have enough support where they're at, there's this high chance that they become overwhelmed, right? And I think it really comes down to support and structure, making sure that we have it at an adequate level or don't fade it too quickly. So I don't know if you have any additional comments on that one.
Well, so I was just going to ask you, you know, we've had several visuals in this presentation. Do any of those visuals work to kind of think about as you go through these? I was thinking about the one kind of some upward movement, and you talked about the bridges in different spots, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that you have a really immediate decline, right? And it's pretty obvious, right? They're calling you or they're not picking up phone calls, right? They're just super stressed, and you have that really drastic dip, I think is what you would end up seeing here. And hopefully there's enough red flags that you would be able to jump in quickly. Although that's not always the case. I think there's a factor of I'm too proud to ask for help.
Yeah.
And maybe if we don't have enough support, we don't have enough support to even recognize that there's a red flag. So that might be an overgeneralization, but that's off the top of my head. I think when you move someone too quickly through the continuum, that we don't solidify this sense of purpose or sense of identity. And that ends up taking shape as you move through. Now, not that it can't happen at the community-based level, but when someone gets to the community-based level and they don't have a sense of purpose, that's when we see them fail.
Yep.
Right. And Abe I think is a really great example.
Well, and I'll come from a clinician perspective here too. Like, something that clinicians can get caught up doing is just ask, what are your goals? What are your goals, right? And then we kind of get tasky. We set short-term goals to build to the long-term goals, and we get really tasky with it, and sometimes start to miss then, why do you get out of bed in the morning, right? Is it just to do sit-to-stands or to strengthen specific muscles? No.
Yeah.
It's about so much more than that, right? And so then how do we tie those things to the task to make sure that we're not missing?
Well, now you're getting to skill generalization. I mean, I think that we're going to show maybe some things to fix this. But I'm always fascinated. As a clinician, I think you saw this too. I thought when they went through our program, we got these people set up so well. And I'm like, oh, we knocked this one out of the park. And then there was so much that we missed when they went home because they were in our facility. It wasn't that we didn't try. It wasn't that we didn't think about it. It's just you can't predict everything. And there's so many factors that start to come into play that you can't simulate in a clinic, right? Even if at the brick and mortar post-acute level as well as outpatient level, you just can't simulate life. And we see this all the time where like our skills, they look really great in a formal structured setting, but it doesn't generalize to the real world. And we need to be on the lookout for that. I think the next one kind of goes up to this overwhelmed situation. So just making sure socially is one of the hardest things we see people be able to tackle, right? Reintegrating socially and friend groups and sense of community and how do they cope with that is a really big deal. And again, I think it comes down to support. Slower or prolonged recovery. We talked about this to a degree where, what does it look like if you think someone's in between going to a post-acute program or a community-based program? And what if you just took a little bit you just decided to put them in a post-acute program because you're like, wow, might cost a little bit more, but the intensity is so high that actually in the long run, I'm going to get further faster, right? That's this idea versus if we were maybe making some financial decisions where we say, gosh, let's skip post-acute and put them in community-based because it's cheaper. But if that takes forever, at the end of the day, the cost is maybe the same or similar, or they require a greater amount of support anyways, or it doesn't last because their caregivers are burned out or there's caregiver turnover. So there's a lot of factors to consider here, but I think it really comes down to what's the long-term plan? Do I have a plan for how I'm going to get there and stick to the plan and make some decisions accordingly with a long-term view rather than a short-term view?
I think that cost-benefit analysis of having someone in an inpatient post-acute program versus someone on an outpatient basis for a longer period of time. On the outpatient basis, you're going to miss a lot of the educational piece and that training of caregivers as well.
Well, and there's just less structure and support, right? And so it takes a little bit more maneuvering. It takes a little bit more logistical concerns, right? And so it's just another factor to consider and say, like, how do we get to where we want to get to fastest? Okay, so we make sure we have time. We've identified what happens if we move through too quickly. Here's a few factors, and I think we'll just kind of run through these pretty quickly. Brad, go ahead and go with this. I'll take the next page.
Yeah. So again, those bridges are those kind of hinge points that you have to navigate, right? So we've got to understand and set expectations. Think about motivate with meaning, right? Help them understand what's going to happen, why it's going to happen, so they're buying into that, and it's tied to what is important to them. Build strong relationships with people. Trust goes so far. That rapport with people goes so far. Promote hope and optimism while balancing that realism, right? So we always talk about like, hey, plan for the worst, hope for the best, right?
I think with those two, right, I think we run the risk of being too fluffy.
Sure.
And as professionals in the industry, we tend to dance around things. And what I have found is if I can deliver a message in a way that says, look, here's what we need to be hopeful about, but here's what we need to be
Realistic
mindful
about.
of and,
Yeah.
and realistic about. I think it actually deepens the level of trust and respect that they have for me, and the relationship deepens very quickly.
And you can't necessarily do that well without having the relationship.
Yep. Yep.
Right.
Yep.
So those things all matter. Right. And then gather and share information, not just with the individual, but also with the family, and also with your other clinicians, healthcare providers that you are collaborating with as well.
And I put this one on there really thinking about the transitions in between the levels of care, right? I think about when someone comes to us from an acute facility, it's a two-way street, right? They're sending information to us.
Yep.
It's our responsibility to go get information as well. And then what we do with that information before someone gets in our facility is really important. So how do we get our team excited and know who that person is to the best of our ability, but also say, like, here's some risk factors that we need to consider so that we can be really proactive and move really quickly once they actually get to our campus.
It's always great if I'm getting a new patient at QLI, it's always great if I actually know the clinician that they're coming from.
Yeah.
Because that clinician can say, "Oh, I know Brad over at QLI. You're gonna do great."
Yep.
Right? You can trust them. That's so helpful.
Yep. Just a few more. So being clear on the destination. We've talked about this idea of this is the tie it to the task, right? What's the red flag that we're getting to, and what are the steps that we're going to take in order to get there? I'm always surprised that when I just like say that to someone and say, hey, we have a really great plan. Here's exactly how we're going to get there. It might not be like a straight shot, right? There's going to be some detours along the way, but it allows us to adjust really quickly, and it just sets them at ease and says, okay, we have a really great plan. Now let's get to work, right? The next one, don't settle for simulation, right? This is this idea that we can simulate all we want, whether it be in our post-acute setting or at the community-based setting, but until we put them in their real environment, we don't know how it's going to go. And if we do that without support, we are setting ourselves up for failure. So don't settle for simulation, settle for actually seeing what's going on and seeing what's happening and adjusting in the context of the demands of their life. And then challenge appropriately, right? So we want to push people to the learning zone, right? Which is this comfort zone concept, but we have to push them hard enough, but we can't push them too hard. And this goes back to this feeling of creating a sense of overwhelmed and emotional challenges. And then lastly, don't fade support too quickly, and make sure that we're being proactive with how much we provide. I think we've talked about this one quite a bit. So that brings us to the end. We'd love to take any questions in the chat, any comments in the chat if you think we're full of it, based on some of our polls. While we're here, I'll just launch the last poll as well. And this is for attendance. So make sure that you take the time to answer this as well. How's the chat looking? Anything going on in there?
Bueller?
Yeah. Thank you, Kathleen. Chat is disabled. Use the Q&A for any questions if you have them.
Looks like everyone's answered the poll question. Thank you. Oh.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Pamela. Whoever the anonymous attendee is, we've all been there.
Yeah.
I think that's partly the point of the discussion around, depending on where you're at in the continuum. We talked about this level of predictability that occurs the further on you go. It's a really hard position to be in really early on. So we really feel for our folks at the ICU level, the acute care level. It's really tough. And even at our level, we've made mistakes. And so I think the idea here is that we have dialogue about it. We talk about what we did well, what we didn't, and make sure that we just continue to learn along the way. Tammy, I'm just gonna guess about yours in terms of maybe I'm not quite sure of when is it addressed all throughout or more towards the end. Um, I'm just gonna assume we're talking about decision making, and I think decision making is this cyclical factor. When we talk about bridges and we talk about change curves, right? Like once you solve a problem or address a change, we know that another one is going to come up. And so we have to not only solve the problem, but also be looking ahead. And as industry professionals, it's kind of our job to do both and start to share with this individual, hey, we're through this. Let's celebrate getting through this one. And I'm not trying to be a negative Nancy on this one, but hey, we know that there's more to come. Here's the next big decision that we have to start thinking about, and starting to push them through that process in a way that doesn't overwhelm them. So I think it's all of our responsibilities to start to have these discussions, address them proactively, and make sure that we're giving these individuals the skills and the information they need. Good to see that we're sparking some thoughts, and hopefully there's just some self-reflection. All right. Well, we are at 10 o'clock. We really appreciate everyone's time. For those of you who are still on, we will do our best to get out the information are related to the evaluation form, which, remembering, if you when you fill out the evaluation form, that should trigger us to send you the slides as well as your certificate for CEUs. Brad's the radio voice of the group.
Low and slow.
Yeah. So I'll answer one more question, and those of you who have to hop off, all good. How do you handle questions or delusions of grandeur after an injury? This is that back to how do you provide hope and optimism with this idea of realism? And it's a really hard line to toe. But I often think about, Brad and I are physical therapists by trade. I can't name one person with a spinal cord injury, regardless of their level of injury and severity, that hasn't came to us and said, my big goal is to walk again.
Yep.
And I can't think of one time where I said, hey, that's a terrible goal, we're not going to do that. Right? Even though I don't think it's realistic sometimes. Oftentimes we start to say, hey, that's a really great goal. Let's talk about what we could do to get there. And then we start to balance, like, hey, how are we moving towards that goal? And what do we need to do to shift and make sure that you are still able to be successful within your life? And it's really not up to us to have that decision and that conclusion come to light. It's really up to them, and it's our job to facilitate that.
Yep. Yeah, I was just going to say we have a role and a responsibility to help influence them and to speak into it, to walk alongside them, but it's not our story to write.
Yep. I think that's an important thing. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We hope that you'll join us for our next webinar next month. It will be on CBT with Dr. Jeff Snell, and we appreciate everyone tuning in. As a reminder, we do have several e-blasts. If you're not on the list and you want to be, let us know. Please give us feedback on those.
Reply at qliwebinars@qliomaha.com.
Dynamite drop in, Don. All right.